So what do most Africans think of the slave trade today?
If you go in the streets and ask people what they think about slave trade, everyone will tell you that slave trade was bad. If you ask them, why are you saying this is bad? All they can do is give you the moral reason. I believe the reason is because the scripture says that God has given us a conscience which is able to tell us right from wrong. All the reasons that they're going to give you were moral reasons, because Africans, we have got good morals. So everyone's going to answer from this perspective that it was bad. Why was it bad? They'll tell you that selling your brother or selling your people is bad. But who said it's bad? No, it's going to give you a definite answer. So the general perspective is slave trade was bad. Why? Because of moral reasons. That's all.
So what do you think of the slave trade?
To me, slave trade is a form of judgment on Africa, a form of judgment on the tribes, the families. God has been judging different nations, different people all the time, and I think that was our turn. Because if, for example, if you read the Bible, you see that every time the children of Israel sinned against God or went astray, God would judge them, even sending them into slavery. Because Africans, they worship the dead, so much wars and hatred and witchcraft, superstition. They loved nudity, they loved to walk naked, which is a form of judgment. We had knowledge or the conscience that there is a God who created all things and who must be worshipped, and Him alone. But we didn't worship this God. Rather, we worshipped the spirits of the dead. We worshipped animals. We worshipped big trees. We worshipped big snakes and all sorts of different animals. But at the same time, I think slave trade, to me, was bad because these Western people, even though they had the Bible with them, which tells them, love your neighbor the same way you love yourself, they came here and they didn't love their neighbors. And they didn't practice what the gospel preaches. At the same time, we sold our people freely. No one forced us to sell our brothers and sisters. We would exchange a human being for a bag of salt. We would exchange a human being for a gun. We would exchange a human being for a piece of cloth. We were a people who wanted more power and more wealth. And that just ignited the whole slave trade.
So how did the slave trade work in Malawi?
There were three parties: the Western people, the Arabs and the Indians, and the Africans. I wouldn't point the finger at people from Europe and America that these are to blame for slave trade. Then that would be unfair. Because we did it freely. The African kings and the chiefs and the people did it freely.
What was the role of the African kings in the slave trade?
It would be difficult for the Arabs and the Europeans to come into the territory and buy slaves without getting the permission from the chiefs and the kings. So first and foremost, you had to go through the chief or the king to get authority to buy the slaves.
How did the Arabs participate in the slave trade?
The Arabs were coming in with piece of clothes and with salt and different things and exchange these things with people, with slaves. So it was barter trade initially. They found these covetous leaders in Africa, covetous chiefs and covetous kings who didn't care at all about their people. All they wanted was the material things.
So did Africans consider man to be made in the image of God?
We never had that idea before. We never had the idea that we were made in the image of God. I think that is clearly expressed in the scripture. But what we did, we thought gods were actually human beings. And we believed that when people die, their spirits become gods. Even until now in some areas, you'd have people worshiping the dead and going to the mountains, giving sacrifices to the dead so that they would send them rain, so that they would bring peace, or if there's a famine, that would give us food.
Were there any benefits that came from the slave trade?
Yes, there were so many benefits. There are so many benefits. We saw the coming in of the missionaries preaching the gospel, which changed our perception on human rights, on freedom, which changed our perception in family, on government, on trade. So I compared what we see in the scriptures. Every time the children of Israel went astray, God would bring some sort of judgment, either selling them to slavery or wars or things like those. But immediately after that, He would send them prophets who would turn their hearts back to God. And that's what we saw in Africa. We are lost people, worshiping idols, doing slave trade and all sorts of things. But immediately after that, we had missionaries coming in who preached the gospel, and that changed everything. And also the missionaries brought education. They brought good hospitals. They started building roads. And we benefited from slave trade. We did.
Do you think slavery had a different effect on the slaves in North and South America?
In North America, predominantly, most of the slave masters were Protestants, so they're preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is contrary to idol worship. But if you go to South America, Catholicism, it's the main religion there. And Catholicism has got no problem with idol worship at all. It embraces the idol worship. And that is still going on in South America right now. Even in Africa, Catholicism is still embracing idol worship. It's encouraging people to bring their form of ancestral worship, their traditional dances into the church, the Catholic Church.
What do you think Africans would think of you saying slavery was a judgment?
If you ask a Christian, what do you think about slave? Do you think slave trade is a judgment? No one is going to say slave trade is a judgment. The sole reason is because most of these people are minions. But if you give them hardcore Christianity, real theology, which is basically Calvinism and covenantal theology, definitely people are going to change their mind and going to tell you that slavery was a judgment. Because God is a righteous God. Even though He's a faithful God, but at the same time, He's a righteous God. He has promised two things in the scripture, which is basically the faithfulness of God, eternity or condemnation in hell. And actually, condemnation in hell is a promise, which is just showing that God is indeed a faithful God. And the scripture said so many times, if you're not going to worship me, I'm going to judge you. And judgment was part of God being faithful to Himself.
What happened in Africa when the slave trade ended?
What happened in Africa is that the people from the Western world indeed stopped buying slaves, and they abolished the slave trade. They started to fight against those who were doing slave trade. But at the same time, the form of slavery changed from selling and buying of people to colonizing Africa. In Belgium, the King of Belgium organized a conference which is called the Scramble for Africa. All they did was dividing Africa among themselves, which is basically colonization. And with the coming of colonization, people didn't have rights, people didn't have freedom. These people took away our land. We were under their form of government, whether you like it or not, so it was still slavery.
So does any effects of that continue today?
Yes, we still feel the effects. One of the main effects is that when they came in, since that time until now, we failed to stand on our own and provide for ourselves. We still wait for the Western world to give us aid. It's not just they give. Yes, they give us some aid for free with no strings attached at all. They'll demand us that if you want us to give you aid, you do A, B, C, D. One of the newspapers in Malawi carried out this story on the front page. Accept homosexuality or forget UK aid. That's what the UK government told the Malawi government. That unless you accept homosexuality, unless you legalize homosexuality, we are no longer going to give you aid. That is still some form of slavery.
So why would you consider that to be a form of slavery?
Because we are not yet independent. Even though we had independence, even though each and every country now in Africa says it is an independent country, none of any of these countries are fully dependent on themselves. We all wait on aid from Europe. We all wait on aid from IMF. We all asking for aid from World Bank and from UN and from United States, and even from China.
So in a real sense, the borrower is slave to the lender is still perpetuating slavery in Africa.
Definitely.
You say that slavery continues in Africa. What will end it?
The gospel of Jesus Christ, first and foremost, the scripture says, it sets you free. You're no longer a slave of man, you've become a slave of righteousness. You're no longer a slave of sin, you're a slave of Jesus Christ. So what we need is the gospel. What we need is the gospel, because the gospel will change the way we think about work. The gospel will change the way we think about government. The gospel will change the way we think about family. The gospel will change everything that we know, how we look at everything that we know and everything that